The air in the Manhattan conference hall was heavy with anticipation. The flags, the lighting, the polished introductions, it all screamed diplomacy, but beneath the gloss lay something raw, waiting to erupt. Jessica Tarlov, flanked by her team and camera crews, had just wrapped her opening remarks. She was eloquent, rehearsed, precise, her words woven with data, alliances, and the favorite Western phrase, democracy promotion. America doesn't interfere, she said with a smile. We support voices. We build institutions. We bring democracy. The applause came quickly. Polite. Predictable. Until the next voice cut through it like a cold wind. Ibrahim Traoré stood, not rushed, not defensive, but with the calm of someone who'd seen too much to be impressed by speeches. No tie, no script, no pre-approved talking points. Just presence. He looked directly at Jessica, then to the audience. You say you bring democracy, he began, voice low but steady. But what arrives with you is surveillance, conditions, and armed guards. The room stiffened. He walked forward, gently placing a single photo on the front podium, children in Burkina Faso waving broken smartphones instead of flags. These are the tools you give us, he said. Not to vote. To be watched. Jessica leaned forward, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and irritation. Are you accusing the US of imperialism, Mr. Traoré? He didn't blink. I'm saying your help always seems to come with a leash. And someone holding the other end. Gasps. Not from the panelists, but from the audience. Students, journalists, even a few diplomats exchanged glances. Jessica's smile faltered. She tried to regain her footing. Democracy isn't perfect, but it's better than the alternatives. Traoré took a step closer. Your version of democracy always seems to make you the alternative. Silence. The kind that isn't empty, but loaded. And just like that, the event wasn't about partnerships anymore. It was about power. The moderators scrambled. A new question was quickly directed to the next panelist, something harmless about regional cooperation. But no one was listening anymore. Because the mood had changed. Jessica adjusted in her seat, crossed her arms, and narrowed her eyes toward Traoré, who now sat calmly, arms folded, unbothered by the sudden tension he had created. She leaned toward her mic. With all due respect, she began. I don't think it's fair to reduce decades of American engagement to chains and control. We fund education, healthcare, disaster response. Traoré cut in. No raised voice. Just firm clarity. You fund obedience. And when that fails, you fund opposition. A few jaws tightened on stage. One moderator looked visibly uncomfortable. But Traoré didn't flinch. He turned to the audience. Ask yourselves, how many leaders welcomed US support and fell when they stopped taking orders? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Not applause. Not outrage. Just quiet realization. Jessica tried to steer it back. So you'd prefer Chinese influence? Russian arms? Is that your idea of sovereignty? Traoré paused, then answered with a question of his own. Is choosing between foreign masters your definition of freedom? That struck deeper than intended. Because suddenly, the debate wasn't about superpowers anymore, it was about the illusion of choice. The illusion Jessica had packaged in fluent English, dressed in policy, sealed with diplomacy. Jessica smiled tightly, but her voice had lost its earlier conviction. You're speaking in extremes. Traoré answered softly. No. I'm speaking from experience. And the audience knew. She had documents. He had dust in his lungs. The panel moved on. Or tried to. But the energy was no longer scripted. The rules had been rewritten. And the one rewriting them had no permission, and no intention of asking. After the session, the lobby filled with whispers. Some called Traoré defiant. Others said disrespectful. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: he had cracked the illusion. Jessica stood near a marble pillar, surrounded by reporters asking carefully worded questions. "Do you think Mr. Traoré was unfair in his criticism?" She smiled diplomatically. "I think he speaks from pain, and I respect that. But pain doesn't build governance. Partnerships do." Meanwhile, Traoré exited through the side door, not escorted, not surrounded. Just walking freely. A student ran up to him and asked quietly, "Do you believe the US means harm?" He stopped. "I believe the US means to stay on top. And it calls that leadership." The student didn't answer, just nodded. Later that day, a private roundtable was held behind closed doors. Jessica was there. So was Traoré. The topic: foreign aid and accountability. Jessica pulled up a chart. Burkina Faso receives over $200 million annually in U.S. assistance. Schools, medical aid, infrastructure. Is that control? Traoré looked at the chart, then at the faces around the table. Who builds the schools? American contractors. Who supplies the medicine? Western companies. And who chooses what gets built, and where? No one answered. Traoré continued. You call it aid. We call it outsourced sovereignty. Jessica interjected sharply. But the outcomes, aren't they good for your people? Traoré leaned in. It's not just what is given, Ms. Tarlov. It's what is taken in return. The voice. The choice. The right to refuse. A heavy silence followed. Because in that moment, the room understood, he wasn't rejecting help. He was rejecting dependence disguised as generosity. And for once, no one could argue that point without proving him right. That evening, the summit held a televised panel. The stage was sleeker, the tone more polished. This was the part meant for optics, broadcasts, clips, headlines. Jessica was back in full command mode, seated center stage beneath the glowing banner, Global Progress Through Partnership. She opened with confidence. Democracy is not just an idea, it's a structure. And structures require stability, funding, and collaboration. The audience clapped. Cameras panned. Then it was Traoré's turn. He didn't match her smile. He didn't reach for diplomacy. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a faded copy of a treaty, one signed decades ago between his country and a Western power. "This is what partnership looked like to my grandfather," he said. "You took our gold. You gave us rules." Jessica shifted slightly. "That was then. We've evolved." Traoré nodded slowly. "Yes, you have. From chains to contracts. From occupation to influence. The vocabulary changed. The power didn't." A ripple moved through the crowd. Jessica responded smoothly, a practiced move. "Influence can be positive, Mr. Traoré. Look at the growing number of African voices in global forums, international media. And who decides which voices are amplified?" Traoré asked, cutting in. "Who funds the platforms? Who edits the message?" The air thickened. Jessica tried to pivot. "Would you prefer isolation? Silence? The world ignoring you altogether?" Traoré answered instantly. "I'd prefer a voice that doesn't need permission to be heard." The audience grew still. Because somewhere between the debate prep and the lights, a simple truth had broken through: freedom isn't how many microphones you get, it's whether you're allowed to speak when it's inconvenient. And Jessica knew, just for a moment, that her smile couldn't cover that. The clip went viral within hours. Traoré's line, "I'd prefer a voice that doesn't need permission to be heard," was replayed on news networks, social feeds, and university forums. But while the public wrestled with the meaning, those behind the scenes scrambled to do damage control. Jessica's team released a carefully worded statement. Democracy thrives on disagreement. This exchange is proof of that vitality. But Traoré didn't issue a statement. He didn't need to. The next morning, he visited a university campus in the Bronx for a youth roundtable, unannounced, informal, unfiltered. One student asked, "Do you really believe all foreign aid is manipulation?" Traoré smiled gently for the first time in days. "No. Not all. Some is genuine. But even genuine aid can become a weapon, when it's used to say, 'Now you owe us.'" Meanwhile, Jessica was in a private interview with a top cable network. "I think Mr. Traoré is emotional," she said. "And emotion can cloud judgment." The anchor raised an eyebrow. But didn't his points resonate with younger voices? Jessica's tone tightened. Resonance doesn't equal accuracy. He's passionate, yes. But passion without policy is just noise. That clip went viral, too, but not in the way she intended. The comments poured in. "He's lived what you study. Policy without pain is the real noise. You taught debate. He taught history." At that moment, it became clear. Jessica was losing the narrative, not because she lacked facts, but because she lacked lived truth. Back in his hotel, Traoré reviewed the news. He didn't grin, didn't gloat. He turned to his aide and said quietly, "They built a system where you can speak freely. So long as you say what they want to hear." And that's when he knew. This wasn't just a debate. It was the beginning of a larger reckoning. 2 days after the panel, an internal email from a U.S. diplomatic official leaked. It described Traoré as a charismatic populist with dangerous influence over global youth narratives. The phrase spread fast. And it did more damage than they expected. Traoré didn't respond in press conferences. He didn't demand an apology. Instead, he walked onto the floor of a town hall event in Philadelphia, where dozens of young Americans waited to hear from him, not because they agreed, but because they were curious. He began without slides or slogans. "You call it dangerous," he said. "But maybe it's just dangerous to the comfort of those in power." Jessica, watching from a studio in D.C., was prepping for her next segment. A producer asked, "Are you going to mention the leaked memo?" She hesitated. Then, "No. He'll just use it as proof he's right. That's what populists do." The word, populist, was meant to discredit. But outside her world of consultants and teleprompters, it didn't land the way she hoped. At the event, Traoré continued. "You speak of democracy as if it's an export. But democracy, if it's real, should never need packaging. It should never come with soldiers or trade conditions." A woman in the back raised her hand. "So what do you want from the U.S.?" Traoré looked at her, not as a politician, but as a man who had seen his people bury hope beneath contracts. "I want you to stop calling power generosity. I want you to stop selling silence as stability. And I want you to listen, not to me, but to the people whose lands you walk on like they owe you something." In D.C., Jessica was already live on air again, calling Traoré's tone confrontational and counterproductive to progress. But something had shifted. People weren't tuning in for her polish anymore. They were listening for the voice that wasn't supposed to make it on stage at all. In a well-lit studio in New York, Jessica sat across from a prominent journalist on live television. The topic, foreign policy and rising anti-West sentiment. Her tone was firm, polished, and practiced. "What we're seeing isn't a rejection of democracy," she explained. "It's a misunderstanding of what democracy requires. Leaders like Traoré appeal to emotion but offer no real alternatives." The host nodded cautiously. "Still, his message seems to be resonating globally, especially with youth." Jessica smiled politely. That's the danger of charisma without accountability. But even as she spoke, the control she once had over the narrative was slipping. Across social media, Traoré's quiet fire was spreading, not through press releases or government-backed outlets, but through clips, memes, and phrases people couldn't forget. You call it democracy. We call it discipline. That line alone had over 10 million views. And the more Jessica tried to frame him, the more obvious the frame became. At a university in Chicago, a political science professor paused mid-lecture and played a 30-second clip of Traoré speaking about the cost of Western alignment. Afterward, a student asked, "Why don't our leaders talk like this?" The room fell quiet. Meanwhile, Jessica's next interview went live that evening. She leaned into the argument she had rehearsed all week. Democracy must come with structure. That includes oversight. If Traoré resists oversight, what does that say about his values? That was the moment Traoré finally responded. He posted a single message. Oversight isn't the issue. Ownership is. You don't oversee equals. You oversee subjects. No hashtags. No thread. Just a sentence that hit harder than a press conference. And with that, the labels, populist, emotional, dangerous, began to lose their weight. Because people weren't looking for perfect anymore. They were looking for unfiltered. And Jessica, polished as she was, couldn't compete with that. Jessica was flown out to Brussels to attend a closed-door strategy session with key Western diplomats and media analysts. The topic? Countering narratives that undermine U.S. credibility abroad. One official spoke plainly. Traoré's words are being picked up in places we never expected, student unions in Berlin, youth groups in Nairobi, even congressional interns in D.C. Jessica responded with measured frustration. Because we let him own the emotional ground. If we don't reset the story, we lose the room. But outside that room, something else was happening. Traoré had returned to Ouagadougou, but his reach hadn't diminished. From a simple desk with a cracked laptop and no teleprompter, he gave a live address streamed to over 80 countries. You said you bring democracy, he began. But we saw you bring drones. You said you support our rights. But we saw you choose our leaders, when they suited your needs. You said you want peace. But your silence at our funerals is louder than your speeches. Across cafes, phones, and dorm rooms, young people listened, not just in Africa, but in America, Europe, Asia. Not because he was famous, but because he sounded like someone who'd lived through the consequences of their textbooks. Jessica, reviewing the transcript later, closed the file and whispered to herself. This isn't policy anymore. It's personal. She was right. Because Traoré wasn't just critiquing systems. He was calling them out with receipts, with images, treaties, headlines they had buried but never erased. That night, a journalist asked her one last question. What do you say to young people who believe Traoré speaks more truth than our elected officials? Jessica paused. Then answered. I say they're listening to a man who doesn't understand how fragile the world is. But maybe that's what made Traoré so powerful. He wasn't protecting the world as it is. He was daring to build it as it should be. The final panel of the summit had been billed as a unity session, intended to show the world that despite disagreements, democracy could thrive through dialogue. Jessica and Traoré were both seated again, this time side by side. No moderator. No formal podiums. Just 2 microphones, 2 chairs, and a silent audience waiting for fireworks. Jessica opened with composure. We can debate methods, but let's not forget, we're all fighting for progress. Traoré didn't nod. He didn't smile. We're not fighting for the same thing, Jessica, he said calmly. You're fighting to maintain a structure. I'm fighting to dismantle one. The room went still. Jessica leaned forward. So you reject cooperation? I reject coercion dressed as cooperation. She pressed further. Then what's your solution, Mr. Traoré? Nationalism? Isolation? He looked at her, not with anger, but pity. My solution is to stop pretending that dependence is development. That debt is opportunity. That applause means agreement. The silence was heavy. Then Traoré turned directly to the cameras. We don't want to be saved. We want to be respected. And we're no longer asking. Jessica's face tightened, her fingers curling slightly around the microphone. She glanced to the side, as if searching for a lifeline in a room that had already chosen its own truth. Later that evening, as press flooded social media with images and clips, a meme went viral, Jessica holding charts, Traoré holding silence. The caption? One studied freedom. The other lived without it. Backstage, a U.S. advisor turned to Jessica and said quietly. He didn't win on policy. He won on presence. She didn't respond. Because deep down, she knew. Some battles aren't lost in argument. They're lost when the crowd realizes who never needed to argue in the first place. Days after the summit ended, the videos continued to spread. Subtitled in dozens of languages, Traoré's message found its way into classrooms, activist circles, and even quiet conversations inside policy think tanks. Jessica returned to Washington. Her resume remained impressive. Her confidence remained intact. But something had changed, and she knew it. She stood before a Senate committee, debriefing on the summit's outcomes. One senator leaned in. You were challenged pretty hard. Did he get under your skin? Jessica paused. Then answered. He got under all our assumptions. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré walked alone through a village that had been overlooked in every donor report. There were no cameras this time. No suits. Just him and the people he'd never stopped speaking for. An elder approached him and said, You shook them. Traoré replied, No. I reminded them. Reminded them of what? The man asked. That freedom isn't granted by treaties. It's claimed by truth. Back in the U.S., students began quoting him in their papers. Podcasters repeated his lines. Even some skeptical journalists admitted, he didn't ask for power, he forced us to re-examine ours. Jessica was invited to a televised follow-up. The host asked, What would you say to Traoré now, if he were watching? She looked directly at the camera. I'd say, next time, I'll listen more. But across the ocean, Traoré wasn't watching. He didn't need to. Because while others chased attention, he had something far more powerful. A message that outlasted the microphone. And in every quiet place where someone once felt small, they now whispered words Jessica would never forget. You bring control. But we bring the end of it.